Allison here from counselingtransforms.com, where we help our clients achieve their best self, better relationships, and a more balanced life. Today's topic is boundaries, mistakes that rookies make. One of the first mistakes that people who are not used to doing boundaries make are over-explaining. So when you think of a boundary, think of the I feel, I want, or need statement. So I feel, insert emotion, like I feel happy, sad, glad, mad. And I need, insert behavior. I need you to be kinder in your approach. I need you to help with the chores. I need a hug. So short, sweet, to the point, one sentence, and it's a statement. It's not a question. It's not a you statement. You this, you that, you always, you never. That's where it needs to end. So ideally, when you're first asserting a boundary, you make a very clear, short statement. Here's my emotion. Here's the behavior that I would like. And then you can add a consequence if necessary. So, for example, I feel hurt. I need you to use a kinder tone, or I'm going to insert the consequence. For example, hang up the phone, go in the other room, go for a drive, go for a walk, end this conversation for now. Those would be examples. So that is basically just a sentence or two, maybe one sentence for the boundary part and maybe one sentence for the consequence part. That's sufficient, because here's the problem. If I over-explain, so perhaps I might say, when you raise your voice, it triggers my family of origin stuff, and it reminds me of my dad, and then I get all anxious, and then I can't hear what you say. Way too much information for the boundary. The boundary needs to be short, clear, concise, and to the point for maximum effect. Otherwise, it gets lost in the data flow, like if I'm over-explaining the whole thing. So keep it short, sweet, and to the point. Make it crystal clear, and then you add the consequence to modify the behavior. So over-explaining is a tactical blunder, because someone who is a boundary buster, they're going to take the information when you give them too much information, and they're going to pick it to pieces. They'll find a flaw in it. They'll find a data point to argue, like, I didn't say that, I said this, or it wasn't Tuesday, it was Wednesday. And it muddies the whole thing. So if you want to be good at boundaries, you need to be very clear, very concise, very direct, and kind in your presentation, but then just add the consequence. Don't over-explain. Explaining is basically like lecturing a teenager. They just glaze over and don't pay attention to what you say, or they refute what you're saying. So clear, concise, to the point. That's the best way to assert a boundary. Another mistake that rookies make when it comes to setting boundaries is waiting too long to assert or to make the boundary known, like to verbalize it. And here's an example from True Life Adventure where I had a client. She was a mom, had a young child, like 6 years old. Child's bouncing on the couch. Boing, 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 better stop. Boing, 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 gonna break your arm. Boing, 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 gonna break the couch. Boing, 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 gonna break the table. Pow! So mom spanked the child, and the child was upset, not because her mom spanked her in this case, but because she usually got 10 more bounces or so before mom would react and spank her. That is a mistake. So here's how it's supposed to roll with boundaries. First of all, you clearly communicate, and then you enforce. But you need to clearly communicate your limit or your boundary quickly when you first notice the infraction, when you first notice the problem. So, for example, like the mom, okay, I feel frustrated and I need you to stop bouncing on the couch, or I'm going to give you a timeout. Stop. One more boing, timeout. Not 16 warnings, please stop, or I'm going to consequence you. One more boing, timeout. So boundaries need to be clearly communicated and enforced consistently every single time to be effective. That's how behavior is modified, along with an appropriate consequence. So when you're going to do a boundary, you need to do it quickly. Don't wait too long, because if you wait too long, number one, the other person isn't really going to think that you're serious about the boundary. Number two, when someone is doing something that bothers me and I don't address it, it builds up, it builds up, it builds up, and then I have growing resentment, and then I can snap, and then I'm not going to present myself well. And another part that we need to think about is boundaries need to be presented from a neutral emotional stance, not out of anger. Boundaries are supposed to help improve communication and relationship, not damage it. So when you're doing a boundary, the rule of thumb is identify when someone else's behavior adversely affects you directly, not indirectly, directly. like your time, your finances, hurt your feelings, those kinds of things. And then address it soon. When you first notice that you're hurt or angry, don't let it fester and percolate for a long time, or you're going to come across as just an angry person, and then the other person won't take your boundary as seriously. Another boundary rookie error is not following through with the consequence part, not communicating the consequence. Actually, it will work either way. So remember, a boundary to be a boundary, it has to be clearly communicated, ideally in advance, ideally from a neutral emotional stance, and then it needs to be enforced every single time to be effective, with a consequence if necessary. So most people tend to communicate their limit or their boundary. And remember, a boundary is when someone else's behavior adversely affects me directly, then I have the right to set a boundary or a limit on that behavior. So I might clearly communicate like, hey, I need you to be on time, for example, or I need you to pay half of this bill, or I need you to empty the dishwasher, or I need you to be kinder in your tone. Those are all examples of potential boundaries. But I need to add the consequence component of it and enforce it for a boundary to be effective. Henry Cloud said it really well. He said, a boundary without a consequence is merely a suggestion. The problem with that is when I suggest, when I remind, when I lecture, when I nag, I frustrate the other person and I have a growing resentment in myself. So when you're doing a boundary, step one is you clearly communicate the boundary. Don't hint, don't beat around the bush, very clear, very direct. You do it from a place of kindness, though, not an attack. So you assert the boundary, you communicate the boundary, and then you need to communicate the limit and enforce the limit with the consequence every single time. And then you need to apply the consequence to modify the behavior. One of the things that gets in the way of that is rookies tend to feel guilt or fear when they're not used to asserting a boundary, and that can be problematic. So you can expect that you're going to have to push through fear or guilt or both when it comes time to enforce a boundary or a limit that you've set on a behavior that is damaging to you. That's normal, completely normal. The cool thing about it is if you push through that fear or guilt or both and you're consistent, it will modify the behavior, or that other person, you will end up distancing yourself from them because of the boundary. Either way, the hurtful or damaging or inappropriate behavior stops. So it's a win-win either way, but it gives the other person a chance to learn how to treat you in a way that works for you. Another mistake that rookies, when it comes to boundaries, can make is, I call it the ignore and zap. You see this a lot with parents, where a child will be acting out in a way that bothers the parent. They don't deal with it, or they might threaten, but they don't follow through with an appropriate consequence consistently. And then the resentment and anger in the parent build up, and then they zap the kid. That could be something from you're grounded for the rest of your life, which is inappropriate and really ineffective kind of a consequence, to screaming or yelling or whatever other kind of way their anger might come out. And that's problematic. So we don't want to ignore boundaries. We want to address them as soon as we recognize that there's a problem. Speak up, use the I feel, I want, or need statement. I feel this, label your emotion, and I need this, label the behavior that you require or you want, and then apply a consequence if necessary. That will modify the behavior, but don't ignore it, because if you ignore it, even if you're trying to be the bigger person or trying to be patient, if you wait too long, what's going to happen is anger and resentment will build in you, and then it'll come out in a way that you don't intend. Let's face it, none of us really communicate effectively when we're rip-roaring mad. So if you do boundaries quickly, when you first recognize there's an issue and you enforce it consistently, it's amazing what happens, because I can stay calm, cool, collected. I tend not to be angry. And in fact, there's a direct correlation with people with anger issues and a lack of boundaries. So if you want to stay calm and cool and collected, make sure that you're doing the boundaries consistently and appropriately, and watch your relationships and your communication improve.